All right, for everyone that's just now tuning in, we just got a couple more minutes here. In the meantime, if you want to just check in with your chat box, feel free to introduce yourself, let me know who's on here, and feel free to answer the question of the day. What was your most recent accomplishment? So we will get started here very shortly, and we'll just give it some more time while some people roll in here. So in the meantime, if you guys are having any difficulty hearing me, you do have the option to switch over to listening through your phone. So there's instructions there on the screen for you if you're having any issues with that as well. Also, if for any reason you have any video problems, typically the best way is to just log out and then log right back in, and that should help. I am at home on my Wi-Fi here, but in the past it has worked pretty well. So hopefully we won't have any problems. And I apologize ahead of time if my dogs bark during this. My babysitter hasn't worked today, so I have the dogs with me. So hopefully they don't bark too much. All right, so it is noon and we will get started. So thank you everyone for taking some time on this Friday at noon during your lunch hour to listen and learn about invasive species and how to ID them. And then also we're gonna talk about how to control them and manage them a little bit. So first off, oops. Uh-oh, it's not. There we go. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about, what is an invasive species, and particularly what makes a species invasive, and why are we so concerned about invasive species. Then we're going to go into a lot more specifics, talking about specific invasive species, how to identify them, what their behavior is, and how to manage them. And then we're going to briefly talk at the end about how you can help manage invasive species in your community, and I will also provide additional resources. And as always, there is going to be a Q&A at the end. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to type them in the chat box, and I will get to them at the end of this webinar. And I'm also open to any off-topic questions as well if we have the time. Just another note, there's going to be a lot of information on these slides. I know it's kind of a new subject, and there's just a lot of information out there. Don't feel like you need to take any notes or rush around during this webinar. This webinar will be recorded, and the PowerPoint slides that you see currently, they will be available on our website to download, so you can print out all of the information and have it there, as well as all of the links and resources we'll provide at the end. So I thought I would start off here, just starting off with some quiz, because there's a lot of information about invasive species. It's kind of a newer subject, and there's some really interesting information out there. So the first question is, how many non-native species are there in the United States? If you guys can just type in your chat box what you think, and I'll let you know the answer. Too many, yeah, I have to agree with that one, for sure. And this is non-native species. It doesn't have to be specifically invasive. These are just species that are not native to this area. Any other guesses? Thousands. You're pretty close there. All right, so the answer is actually about 50,000 non-native species exist here in the United States. The good news, give or take, is that only about 10% of those non-native species are considered invasive. But that being said, the ones that are invasive tend to cause a lot of destruction and cause a lot of people some headaches. So that's why we're so concerned about it. And I'll talk a little more about what exactly they cause and why they're so concerning to us. Question number 2. So what percentage of our endangered and threatened species are at risk primarily due to non-native and invasive species? Any guesses? You can just throw them in the chat box there. 20%, 98%. Some good guesses. So the answer is actually 42%. So almost half of our threatened and endangered species that we have here in the United States are at risk primarily due to invasive species. So if you think about that first figure and that first question I asked, you know, only a few of the non-native species we have are invasive, but of those invasive species, they cause quite a bit of destruction. They really harm a lot of our, you know, our native species that we want to protect and keep here. All right, so next question is, are there any native species from the United States that are invasive elsewhere? Yeah, good job. So yes, there are tons of them. So we're not the only ones that are having these issues, of course. We live in a global society these days, and there's global commerce. So of course they get spread throughout. But there's just, you know, there's just a little list right there of some of them. I don't even think I have any plants on there. But yes, absolutely, the United States has native species that are invasive elsewhere. So it's not just us. And here is my last question for you guys. Who is pictured here? All right, so this was actually kind of a trick. I like Brent's response. This was kind of a trick question. This is the tree of heaven. It's very commonly mistaken for the staghorn sumac or a black walnut, like a young black walnut. They do look very similar, but I will explain the differences later on. And I also cannot talk about tree of heaven without mentioning the spotted lanternfly, which is yet another invasive species that guaranteed next year at this time you will be very familiar with them. Unfortunately, they are in the southern end of our county, and they are a favorite. They love to land on these tree of heaven. So while they are destructive to tree of heaven, they can be destructive to quite a few many other plants, and it's really a concern. I'm not going to go too in depth with this because we are focusing on plants in this webinar, but I really wanted to at least show you guys the spotted lanternfly in its aphid stage and also in its nymphal stage. And like I said, we're going to primarily focus on plants for this webinar. There are so many other invasive species that we could talk about, from animals to bacteria, and there's just a couple of them, but we're going to focus primarily just on just on plants for this webinar here. So first we have to ask ourselves what an invasive species is. I'm sure a lot of you on this webinar are relatively aware of it. The name kind of speaks for itself, but to start off, you want to define what a native species is. And a native species has a whole bunch of different definitions, but in general, a native species is something that occurs naturally within an ecosystem without any human introduction. So the native species were here, before humans colonized it, and they are adapted to our native conditions that we have. A non-native species would be the complete opposite of a native species. It's something that doesn't naturally occur around here and was probably introduced by someone else. An introduced species is exactly that. It's a non-native plant that was brought in intentionally. And an exotic is a non-native plant that was brought in intentionally or unintentionally. So it just means it comes from a foreign area. There are also noxious species, which are almost always going hand in hand with invasive species. But these actually can be native plants, and these are any plant that is harmful to crops, livestock, ecosystems, and humans. In a lot of cases, these might be poisonous or something like that. And of course, finally, getting down to what an invasive species is, it's any non-native or can be a native plant that outcompetes our native plants and tends to spread out of control. And the key there is that it's going to spread out of control. So our goal is to try to get a management down to them and maintain these so that they don't get out of hand, because there certainly are consequences to that. So what makes a non-native plant invasive? Well, you can look at these two photos here and you can see they have some pretty similar characteristics across the board. Obviously, spreading out and taking over an area is kind of the key characteristic of an invasive plant. They're very adaptable, so they can adapt to any soil condition or climate condition, temperatures, and they really are more of a generalist species, which is why they tend to thrive here outside of their natural range. They rapidly grow pretty quickly, and they also spread pretty quickly, again, because they're such generalists and they can outcompete our native plants. They're able to just take over an area very quickly. And they'll do that by exploiting and colonizing any disturbed ground, which can be anything from, you know, an abandoned field to your own backyard. They thrive in both high and poor nutrient conditions. A high nutrient condition would include something like if we went and put fertilizers on our lawn and we have excess fertilizers. So they'll take advantage of that. And they also a lot of them will survive in poor nutrient conditions where maybe the soil has been overworked in the past. These guys will still survive on that. They reproduce really quickly, and they often produce a ton of seeds. They'll survive under harsh conditions, so they can survive, you know, freezing conditions or super, super hot weather or really wet, you know, if we have a really rainy season, they can generally survive under those types of conditions. They also green up first in the spring in general, which basically means that, you know, they take advantage of the sunlight first, and it makes it so that any seed that's stored in that soil is going to have a lot of difficulty growing when it's ready because they're already being overshadowed by the invasive species. And they also have a lack of any natural predator, pathogen, or parasite, which again really contributes to them just not really having anything of concern, and they thrive, whereas native plants do have natural predators and whatnot. So where are they found? They are obviously, by definition, found outside of their natural range, but they're also primarily, you can find them in any disturbed area. So examples like clearings and edges, fields, woods, roadsides is extremely common. So this is a great way to identify invasive species if they're not on your property, is go take a road trip somewhere. Often along a stream side, any developed area, and possibly your own backyard. So some of the negative impacts of invasive species you can see just by looking at this photo. Now this photo is a photo of kudzu, which luckily I have not seen this in Columbia County, but it's very common in southeastern Pennsylvania. And again, you can see all the negative impacts that an invasive species causes. Of course, they're outcompeting our native species. They reduce habitats. They change water, light, and nutrient availability. They're disrupting plant-pollinator relationships, especially if they're outcompeting a flowering plant and the flowers aren't there. And that's especially a concern considering that 1/3 of our food supply requires plant-pollinator relationships in order for us to consume those. They took over garden areas, so any area that you're trying to invest in and try to make pretty can very easily be taken away by these invasive species. They do host plant pathogens, and they'll bring them over. They are less nutritious, so our wildlife don't benefit quite as much. Some of them, especially the vining ones, will girdle a tree, which basically means over time they'll kind of strangle the tree until the tree dies. They contribute very heavily to soil erosion because these plants didn't grow up in native conditions like we have here, and they're used to other soil conditions. They tend to have a lot shorter of root systems, and unfortunately, when you have a short root system, you get a lot of soil erosion. There's also changes in community succession. I don't want to go too in depth about this, but it's a concept that basically over time, an ecosystem changes over time. And generally, you know, when you have initially a disturbed area, you start forming grasses and forbs, and then you'll get shrubs, small trees, and then finally you'll end up getting a mature forest in general. But you can see this may be a dramatic, you know, image here, but it's definitely a possibility. If we don't remove our invasive species, we can end up with monocultures and really unproductive ground. Whereas if we're able to get control of these invasive species, we can bring back our forests and all the wonderful benefits that they provide. And this next figure I just find amazing. Every year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reports that they spend $120 billion each year tackling invasive species and the effects that they cause. So I think that's extremely significant, and that figure alone to me is reason for us to focus more on invasive species and really try to get them under control. So just some considerations when we talk about control. Early detection is absolutely key to trying to manage invasive species, even in your own backyard. You can see from that chart there that generally from the point of introducing a species, by the time we detect it, and by the time the public is aware of it and can actually, identify it as a problem, it's way past the point of being able to control it by any means. So that being said, invasive species are out there, but the best thing that you can do is detect it early on when it hits your property and have an action plan that comes with that. So you'll want to know your emergent species in the area. So attending a webinar like this, or just keeping up once in a while with what is an emergent species of concern that you might want to look out for. That is crucial to being able to detect things early on. If you do have a problem, especially a large problem going on, you can have or develop a maintenance plan for your species, and there's certainly professionals out there that can help you with that as well as the conservation district. And it sounds counterintuitive, but in most cases, it's always recommended that you want to tackle the lowest density areas first, as opposed to like very invaded areas. Just because it is so difficult to control once they're established, you will want to try to start off on the edges or areas that aren't nearly as invaded by these plants, so that you can gain control of those areas, just considering the unfortunate nature of the difficulty of once they're established, it's very hard to remove an invasive species permanently. Another really important factor is to make sure you clean your equipment thoroughly. That even includes, your own shoes and gloves. That is one of the #1 reasons how invasive species spreads, is because they produce so many seeds and whatnot, and that's how they spread, is if we're out there working in the fields and don't realize we're actually spreading it around. There are many treatment options, including anything, manually pulling and cutting them, and also using herbicide applications, which we'll go into a little bit more. And if you have a really big problem, I highly recommend consulting a local forester, whether it's a private forester or one of the state service foresters. They can definitely help you get a plan in check for these. So here's a list of some of the most common Pennsylvania invasive species that we have, marked out by trees, herbs, shrubs, vines, and grasses. The ones in red are the ones I'm going to review. And again, like I said, there's a lot of information that goes with each one of these, so don't feel like you need to take any notes. The PowerPoints will be available for you. But there's just kind of a sampling of the invasive species that you are most likely to come in contact with, and you may have on your backyard already. So first things first is Tree of Heaven. Tree of Heaven is kind of what inspired me to do this webinar in the first place. So I'm going to focus on it a little bit more because this is such a concern. And with the spotted lanternfly coming up, this is definitely going to be something you're going to be thinking about a little bit more and more as the years go on. So how to identify these guys? First of all, I think it's really interesting that these were introduced intentionally, actually in the Philadelphia area back in 1784 as an urban street tree. So it's really interesting that sometimes we actually introduce these things on purpose, and unfortunately they kind of go out of hand without us knowing it. These are very similar looking to staghorn sumac or a small young black walnut, and I will go over the key characteristics that you can tell the difference between these. In a mature plant, you'll notice their bark looks like a cantaloupe rind, which is very distinctive to this plant. They have opposite leaflets, so they have a whole bunch of leaflets on one big stalk, and they have obviously a lot of stalks, so they form these really, really dense kind of canopies in there. And I highlighted that their leaf margins are smooth. So you'll notice in that bottom right photo, the one on the right is smooth and the other one is serrated. That is a key characteristic. If you're able to get up close with a Tree of Heaven, you'll want to look at the edges of the leaf, and if it's smooth, it's a Tree of Heaven. If it's serrated, it's probably a staghorn sumac or a black walnut. And they also have these characteristic little bumps on the bottom of their leaves or their leaflets, and they're called glandular teeth. And that's another very key characteristic to the tree of heaven. So how do you tell the difference between, all these similar looking species? Well, here's the difference here. And there's 3 different things that I like to point out. Obviously, I mentioned earlier about the smooth edges on the leaves, whereas black walnut and sumac do not. They also have these yellow, red-ish kind of winged seeds. Now that's just on a female plant, believe it or not. These are dioecious plants, which means that they have male and female colonies. So if you're driving around right now, you can see these seeds on the female plants, whereas a sumac has their classic red berries, and the black walnut has their green fruits with the walnut inside. And finally, you can also determine them by scent. Tree of Heaven very distinctly smells like burnt peanut butter. I personally actually describe it as cat urine, but burnt peanut butter seems to be a little more politically correct over here. Of course, that is one of the biggest reasons you're going to notice if you have a Tree of Heaven in the area, because they're very strong scented. Of course, a black walnut has that distinct smell, and staghorn sumac don't really have a distinct smell too much. I just want to take a minute really quick to talk about staghorn sumac, because it's easy to say, well, I don't like any of these trees and I want to get rid of them. I want to stress that staghorn sumac is not poisonous sumac. Poison sumac is only found in an acidic bog area. I guarantee you're not going to be walking around in those types of areas. So they're very hard to find. Also, the berries, those red berry clusters, they are a favorite for birds, and they're really vital for birds, especially in the fall as a food source. And you can actually even eat them. You can actually steep that in water and make it, it turns into kind of like a lemonade type drink. So very beneficial to wildlife. And finally, the reason why I like staghorn sumac so much, and I think it's so important to keep in mind, is that it's actually a pioneer species. So I mentioned ecological succession earlier. These are actually a really great indicator that an ecosystem is starting to convert from a grassy area to a woodland. So these are what we call a pioneer species. They're one of the first trees to show up when you go from a grassland to shrubs, and those small trees, the staghorn sumacs are going to be some of the first trees that you see. So it's actually a really great indicator that you have a healthy ecosystem and it's becoming a woodland or a forest. So that's just my side note about staghorn sumac. So if you see all of these plants, you don't have to cut them all down. I do encourage you definitely to try to identify them and only remove the Tree of Heavens. So back to Tree of Heaven, their behavior, right? They can grow super tall. They can get up to about 80 feet, and in some cases they can even get 6 feet in diameter of their trunks, which right now, most of them, they're pretty small, but they do grow very quickly, and as we continue to get more and more, we're gonna be seeing some larger ones coming through. I mentioned they have a very strong odor. They do form very dense colonies of the same sex clones. So like I said, they have male and female plants, and those colonies are all going to be the same sex, and they will behave differently. They're all genetically similar. They produce over 300,000 seeds every year, just one tree, which is just insane. And you can see them, you can see the seeds right now, and there's a photo in that top area that you can check out. And there's also root suckers is another way that they spread, and those root suckers will actually grow up to 50 feet away from its parent tree. So that's definitely a concern because they can really spread pretty rapidly. They're allopathic, which means that they produce chemicals that they send throughout the soil that actually limits the plant growth of any other type of plant in the area. So when you get a Tree of Heaven, and black walnut does the same, basically when you have those types of trees, you almost only get those types of trees because they really limit all the other ones from growing. Of course, Tree of Heaven will grow almost anywhere. I've seen it grow even in the cracks of a sidewalk, and it is a Class B noxious weed in the state of Pennsylvania. So managing Tree of Heaven. Please do not cut this. It will resprout immensely, and it will be such a bother for you. These things, like I mentioned, they have these root suckers, and they will not die if you cut it down. Timing is critical. when it comes to choosing if you want to do an herbicide treatment or if you want to do more of a root systemic herbicide type treatment. And under the herbicide treatment, you'll see that there's a product called Aquatic, which is a type of glyphosate. And there's also other products called Garlon 3A or Vaseline, which is a type of triclopyr. I'm just going to leave them on this slide for now. In the future, as we continue, I'm just going to indicate glyphosate or triclopyr because there's many brands to those, but those are the chemical names. And glyphosate you may be familiar with. It's also the active ingredient in Roundup. But as far as herbicide treatment, you can apply these to the foliage and the bark of the plants. Typically mid to late summer is when you want to apply those. And then also if you're into trying to do a systemic herbicide, which is what I highly recommend, there's a method called a hack and squirt method, where you literally just hack the tree around the diameter of the tree, as you can see in that photo there, and then you put your concentrated herbicide in there. And that allows for the herbicide to spread throughout the tree and go to the root system and really actually work at killing off those plants. So autumn olive is another one. This is a very distinct shrub, very easy to identify. It grows up to about 20 feet tall and it gets pretty wide. It's about 30 feet wide. They have trumpet-shaped white flowers in the spring, and they also produce these little olives that are red fruit clusters you can see in that photo there with silvery scales on them. It's very distinctive to them. They also have a very simple leaf, and I highlighted one of their most easily identifiable characteristic is that the underside of their leaf is a silvery white color, so it shimmers in the sunshine. These guys were introduced as an ornamental shrub in the mid-1800s, and of course, once again, we didn't know it would go out of hand, and here we have them now as an invasive species. They have a lot of fruits that they produce, and of course birds love to eat them, and that's primarily how they spread. They're found along roadsides, pastures, and very commonly in any abandoned field. If you're a farmer, you're probably very familiar with these, and they're tolerant of very poor soils. So to manage these guys, you, again, like the tree of heaven, you do not want to remove or cut these down because they will resprout. If you find smaller ones, you can remove them, but you want to try to get all of their roots, otherwise they'll resprout and you'll be continuing to have to manage them. They recommend a combination of glyphosate and triclopyr treatments. You can do an oil-based treatment on a cut stump or a water-based treatment on cut stems. And if you have a low density site, you can even do a foliage treatment. And again, there's a ton of information out there about herbicides, and it goes a lot more in specifics about how to apply herbicides. I'm not going to go into that with this webinar, but if you look at the bottom right of these slides, you'll notice that there's a link to Penn State Extension, and they have absolutely more information and really great information about how to use herbicides and pick your method of action. Japanese knotweed. Now this is something I guarantee you guys have all seen, but you may not have known what it was. This guy is currently out in bloom right now. Some people like it, some people don't. Most people don't, and they shouldn't, but the bees absolutely love this, which is probably the only benefit to them. So they are a jointed hollow stem. It kind of looks like bamboo. You can see from that photo on the bottom right. They do have reddish purple nodes where the leaves attach to their stems. Their leaves themselves are heart-shaped, and they're quite large leaves. In the late summer, about right now, you'll find that they have white flower clusters in bloom. And actually, their young shoots are actually edible and quite tender. And the Fish and Creek Watershed Association here in Columbia County actually hosts an annual knotweed cook-off. So they absolutely are edible, and there are recipes out there. So these guys can grow up to 15 feet tall, and they spread horizontally. So they have what's called rhizomes, which is a type of root that grows horizontally as opposed to vertically. And that is where the biggest issue with this knotweed is that they have rhizomes, so it's really hard to control them since they don't have a standard root system. They invade stream areas and other wet spots, but they absolutely could be found in any upstream area. And they form these dense monocultures of bamboo-like stems. When I say dense, I mean you almost cannot see through them. And of course, I mentioned they have this underground network of rhizomes as opposed to any root system, and they are a Class B noxious weed in the state of Pennsylvania. These guys, interestingly, were also introduced in the late 1800s from East Asia as an ornamental shrub, and they were actually put along stream banks for erosion control, and it's ironic because they actually significantly increase erosion in the end. So how to manage this? Managing knotweed is going to be extremely difficult. This is one of the hardest ones to manage. You have to eliminate the rhizome system in order to eradicate them, which is the tough part here. It will take about 2 to 5 years of consistent applications and cuttings to get this even just under control. Your option is to do 2 applications of herbicide per year, but I highly recommend the second one, which is a little less intensive and you don't get as much, it's able to be managed and it allows other plants to thrive a little more, is if you cut it in June, after it's used all of its energy to grow and become that bushy plant that it is. You'll want to wait about 8 weeks so that it can grow a little bit more, and then that's when you'll apply herbicide to its new sprouts. The most effective applications are going to occur more in the late season, and you'll want to continually treat these guys as you get new growth. You'll want to continue at it because they can grow completely out of control again. And glyphosate is the #1 product that is recommended for these plants. Japanese barberry is a very compact shrub. It doesn't grow very tall. It's only less than 4 feet tall. They do grow in clusters, and they have very distinct spoon-shaped leaves, as you can see in that photo there. They may be green or reddish, depending on the time of year. These guys were introduced as an ornamental shrub in 1875, which is a common theme here. They were originally used as living livestock fences and hedges and farm fields. And they're actually still sold today in some nurseries and garden centers, unfortunately. They do produce very dense thickets that they have thorns, so they can be quite painful to try to walk through. And they produce really small red berries that actually persist throughout the winter. And again, those birds love to eat berries, so that's one of their primary way of spreading. They do root from their branches as well. So as their branches fall down to the ground, they will root right there. These plants also alter soil pH and biological activity in the soil. And unfortunately, they've been found to be a nursery for deer ticks. So generally, if you have a lot of Japanese barberry, you may have a higher instance of Lyme disease in your area. To manage Japanese barberry, you can manually control these by just pulling them out. However, you definitely will want to put on some protective gear when you're doing that because they do have so many thorns. You can spray their foliage with a combination of glyphosate and triclopyr between the spring and the fall. And you can also cut the stems and do a stem treatment with triclopyr, and that can be done year round. Again, I really stress that if you're working around these Japanese barberries, please be aware of ticks and do a tick check anytime you're around them or after you've removed them. Multiflora Rose. This is actually one of the United States' most abundant and widespread invasive species. It was introduced in the 1860s as an ornamental plant, and then actually again in the 1930s as an erosion control method and a way to contain livestock and fences, actually by the U.S. Soil Conservation Service, which is now the NRCS. So this is once again an intentionally introduced plant that has gone out of control. Their stems can get up to 15 feet long, and they're similar to a Japanese barberry where their stem, if it hits the ground, it can root right there and continue spreading. They have a really fragrant flower from May to June, which is probably the only benefit to them. They do have football-shaped serrated leaflets on them, and their rose hips, shown in that photo there, are produced from midsummer to winter, which are a favorite of birds. One plant can produce millions of seeds per year, which is just absolutely astonishing. And those seeds are actually viable in the soil for up to 20 years, which absolutely tells you why it's one of the most persistent invasive species that we have in the United States, because as much as you control it, say you control it 5 years later, it can germinate again and come back. The rose hips are a favorite by birds, and that's how they're commonly dispersed. and they form a really dense, really tall thicket with thorns. Again, not something you want to walk through, and it is a Pennsylvania Class B noxious weed. So you can pull these. Again, you'll want to be really careful and put some protective gear on. One benefit, you can actually use goats, and goats will eat these, so you can try using goats as a control method. There actually are some biocontrols. There's some diseases and insects out there that like to feed on these rose plants in the rose family. However, I am not entirely sure how you get your hands on them, but they are out there. And when it comes to herbicide applications, you can do an initial mowing and a cutting, treat it with a herbicide, and you can also do foliar sprays. Pretty self-explanatory, but again, those seeds are the primary concern. All right, so I put shrub honeysuckles and Japanese honeysuckles in the same group here, just because they're very similar looking. There are several species of shrub honeysuckles. There's so many different species, I couldn't possibly go into it, but they all have very similar characteristics. They will grow between 6 and 20 feet tall, and they have very fragrant blooms, which is why everyone loves a honeysuckle. When they bloom, they do smell quite beautifully. In the midsummer, they'll get these orange to reddish fruits, depending on the species. And their stems are also, if it's an invasive species, they tend to be hollow, whereas a native honeysuckle tend to be solid. Japanese honeysuckles are very similar, except they're more of a climbing vine. They produce runners that grow along any disturbed area, so you'll often find these along roadsides or fences and whatnot. They grow up to 18 feet in length, and they have these really thick stems. They almost look kind of like a grapevine, but they can get even thicker, and you'll see that in the next slide. They also have very fragrant blooms, and their fruits are black. Here's a slide that shows you just an example of shrub honeysuckles and Japanese honeysuckles and what they look like. And I also added oriental bittersweet and common privet. Those are both also invasive species, very commonly found, even right here in Columbia County. And often when I'm out trying to identify invasive species, and if I know it's a honeysuckle, sometimes I get stumped and find out that it's really a privet. An oriental bittersweet also has a very similar berry. So these are some other invasive species to keep in mind that are certainly very common in this area, and they're all very similar in how they act and how you manage them. So they're very sweet flowering plants in the springtime, and they produce very small seed-bearing fruits, which again, birds and other wildlife love to eat. One note that's really interesting is that they're less nutritious than other native species, and when they are established, they will continue to resprout. They are actually known as an ecological trap, and I have a cardinal picture there because cardinal is actually one of their favorite foods to eat is a native honeysuckle, and our native honeysuckles are a red berry, and that tends to be where the cardinal gets their pigment for their coloration. Now we all know that, you know, a male cardinal is really bright red and beautiful, and they use that to attract the female, right? So they can reproduce. Unfortunately, as we have more and more invasive honeysuckles, there's been a lot of research that have found that these male cardinals that are eating invasive honeysuckles aren't getting as much pigment, and in a lot of cases, they actually appear almost like a female cardinal. So obviously, that's a big concern for their reproduction, their populations. So if you do have a lot of honeysuckles and you notice you're losing your cardinals, that actually may be a reason why. Who doesn't love a cardinal, right? So if you want to manage these, you can manually pull them in small patches. I've done that, and it works very well. You just want to make sure you get that whole root system out. You can regularly mow and cut these and then follow up with an herbicide treatment. And then you can also, in the fall, it's generally recommended to do in the fall foliar application, again, of a mixture of the herbicides there. Mile a minute vine, this is my least favorite invasive species of all time. This one is definitely emerging more and more, and it's quite difficult to manage, and you can see it just covers an entire forest. So it characteristically has a triangular leaf. It's the only one that I know that is that triangular, so it's pretty easy characteristic of it. They also produce these blueberries in the fall time, and the vines can be anywhere from 20 to 30 feet long. It was first reported in York County of Pennsylvania in 1930s, and it's just kind of gone out of control ever since. Like its name says, it grows 6 inches per day, which is astonishing. They also have these really barbed, sticky vines to them, so they stick to everything, and they can grow vertically as well as horizontally. And they form a dense mat, and they smother any nearby vegetation, unfortunately, and they'll smother it out and kill most of the things underneath it. The berries, once again, are consumed by birds in a common way of it spreading out, and it is a Class B noxious weed. So you can pull these, and generally, if you are lucky enough to be able to find its origin, if you pull it, you can kill the whole plant, but good luck finding the original source of that vine. Repeated cuttings will prevent the seed to set, and you can also use a string trimmer to cut it at ground level. There is a biological control called the Mgmt weevil, and I'm not really sure where you can get your hands on that. And you can also, of course, use herbicide applications. Because of the nature of this plant, you might want to consider using a pre-emergent, which by mid-March you can apply. So that'll prevent any germination of any seed. And then you can also do post-emergence, which are basically something you can do throughout the rest of the season after they've germinated. Triclopyr is also a herbicide that you can consider, because these tend to grow in more grassy areas and less, woody plant type areas. And triclopyr is not as much of a threat to any broadleaf plant or grass. So it's a little more selective towards the mile-a-minute vine. So, all right, next is Japanese stiltgrass, which is probably my second least favorite invasive species. This one is just everywhere. I tell everyone that I come in contact with, I would not be surprised if this is going to be the new Kentucky bluegrass in a couple of years. It's just spreading out of control. And you'll see exactly why it's so hard to produce. Its stems form a really dense mat. They don't get too tall, only about 1 to 3 feet tall, but they're very dense and they'll take over a whole woodland area. And they do have a characteristic silvery stripe that runs the length of their leaf. They were first reported in 1919, and they were actually used originally as a packing material for imported porcelain from China, which is an interesting fact there. It is an annual grass, so that contributes to its difficulty in trying to manage these. It produces about 1,000 seeds per plant. And if you just look at the photo there, one plant's pretty small, so that's astonishing how much it can seed. The seed, it can be viable for up to 5 years in the soil, and it germinates in the spring and dies back in the fall. So as an annual grass, it grows and grows and grows. And about this time every year is when they're going to start setting their seed. That seed will overwinter, and in the spring it'll start germinating. So that's very key in trying to figure out how to manage these. They spread really, really quickly, and they will make a crowd in a really thick thatch area. They have really shallow root systems. You can very easily pull these out. However, because they take over such a large area, that's very difficult. And they are found pretty much almost anywhere, but you'll definitely find them on any trail, along the road, floodplains, abandoned fields, you name it. And they're also very commonly carried by like a hiker's shoe, cars, ATVs, equipment. These seeds tend to be a little sticky and they like to go everywhere. There's a couple of ways to manage this. You can mechanically control it by pulling it if you have small patches. Again, if you detect it early on, that's definitely a possibility. You can even use a string trimmer and trim it. And you'll want to also trim it in June after the spring to avoid any second flush, because there can be multiple flushes of this plant throughout the year because there's so much seed storage in the soil right now. You'll want to trim it before the seed head emerges in late August to early September, right about now. You can see that the seeds are extremely tiny, but if you can trim it before the seed emerges, then you can hopefully start reducing the populations in the future. There's also herbicide treatments that you can do. Again, there's pre-emergence to prevent any germination in the spring, which is pretty critical for this type of plant. And there's also post-emergence that you can apply. And really interestingly, and something I'm trying in my own backyard, and it's actually working fairly well, is you can actually create a window and establish a meadow instead of the invasive Japanese stiltgrass. So basically, after you control it and try to get it out of the way, you can prep your soil area and allow native vegetation to try to outcompete and continue that process of ecological succession that I keep mentioning. It's worked fairly well for me, except for this year we had such a hot drought type of weather that, of course, my plants didn't grow as tall as I wanted them to. But it does work. You can replace this with meadow. Poison hemlock, this one is a native species. So this is an example of a native species that can be invasive. This is growing and growing more and more here in Pennsylvania and becoming more and more invasive. There are thoughts going around and research questioning if it's due to climate change, why its behavior is acting a little differently. This is very commonly mistaken for Queen Anne's lace. And probably the easiest way to tell the difference is there are very distinctive purple spots on its stem, and they create a very long 10-inch carrot-like taproot. It is in the carrot family. You can even tell by the foliage, it looks like a carrot or a parsnip, if you will. So these are a biennial, which means the first year of growth will end with a really low growing foliage. And the second year is when you're going to start finding a stem, branch, and the flowers. They can grow up to 6 feet tall. They have really small clusters of white flowers that emerge in June to August that are very similar looking to Queen Anne's lace. They can be found along any stream bank or in meadow areas. And also, I highly encourage you to be careful around these plants. They are toxic to human and animals. This is classically what killed Julius Caesar. So this is very toxic and not something that you want to introduce into your area. And of course, is a Class B noxious weed in the state of Pennsylvania. So you can manually control these by just pulling them and removing them. They're pretty easy to remove. However, you're definitely going to want to wear protective gear when you are touching these. The sap of especially that comes out of the carrot type root, can be a skin irritant. And in no way do you want to consume this because, like I said, it's very toxic and potentially deadly. You can also try an herbicide treatment. You can do post-emergent herbicides that I have listed there. And you'll also want to treat the first year rosettes primarily if you have a large infestation to avoid getting the mature plants later on. The mature plants are the ones that are going to seed and spread. So if you can hit those little rosettes like you see in the bottom left photo there, that'll prevent future poison hemlocks from being able to spread. So that is all the invasive species I wanted to go in depth with. However, there's plenty of other invasive species like I mentioned earlier in the earliest slide that I had. Here's a couple of examples so you can get some visual representations of them. You may or may not recognize a whole bunch of these in here. Some of them are grasses, some produce berries. Some of them, like the purple loosestrife, number 4, is a beautiful plant. I'm sorry, that was Socrates, not Julius Caesar. I apologize for that. The purple loosestrife is actually in bloom right now. So it's an example of an invasive species. It crowds out areas of native plants. And unfortunately, some people like to encourage it to grow. But there's just a whole bunch of different examples of invasive species that can, emerge on your property. There's also aquatic invasive plant species. There's quite a few of them here. Not anything I'm going to go into in depth with right now, but they certainly are a growing concern, especially if you're an avid fisherman like myself. You're probably very familiar with these if you're frequently on the water. So ways that you can help. Of course, the best way is if you can identify and remove any invasive species that's already on your property. You'll want to replace any invasive species, or just in general, you'll want to plant native species only on your property. Also, frequently, or at least annually at minimum, scouting your area for any emerging plants that might be of concern. You'll want to minimize any ground disturbance because these invasive plants do take advantage of disturbed areas. They like to colonize it first before the native plants have a chance. You'll want to use your fertilizers wisely because they will take advantage of those excess nutrients in the landscape. Cleaning boots and equipment, especially if you're out there working directly with these plants, is key because that is another way that they can spread. And also, please tell a friend. Encourage them to check out this webinar or just help them identify anything if you see it in their backyard, because invasive species are not, you know, a household name. They're not very common to identify, but they are certainly a growing problem, no pun intended. And telling a friend absolutely will help the cause. So here are some additional resources. Again, this PDF is going to be available for you to download hopefully by 4 o'clock today. So you can click on those links and they have a whole bunch of different information, especially about more specifics in using herbicides and dealing with weeds and whatnot. I also encourage you guys to check out our other webinars on our website. Just go to our website and click the workshops tab. We've done a bunch of webinars in the past, and we have an upcoming webinar with the Fish and Creek Watershed Association. I'll be talking about trees and the benefits of trees, and also opportunities because the Conservation District is a 10 Million Trees partnership member. So we actually have access to trees that we can get planted completely for free for you guys. So I'll go into a little more detail with that program, but I highly encourage you to join in on September 14th. And again, on our website, you can see the link to get the Zoom link there. I also highly recommend checking out our Pennsylvania Native Plants webinar. It goes a little bit into invasive species, but it also will give you some really great ideas and native plants that you can put in your landscape to help combat these guys. So with that, I'm going to open it up to any questions. I put my contact information there. If you guys have any questions you want to talk to me about, or I can come out to your property and help you identify some invasive species, I'm more than happy to do that. So feel free to write my contact information down. And if you have any questions, just type them in the chat box and I will be more than happy to answer them. So we have about 10 minutes left to this webinar, but like I said, any questions that you guys have, even off topic, I'm more than happy to try my hand at questioning them. If not, I'll definitely get back to you with an answer. So Brent asked if wild parsnip is a big concern. I do not believe that one is. I know that the poison hemlock is extremely closely related to wild parsnip. However, I have not heard of it spreading out in any invasive manner. I could be incorrect in that. Hopefully it doesn't become one. Certainly if it behaves similar to poison hemlock, it certainly could, but I have not heard of that being a concern quite yet. Jay asked about a fox grape. I am actually not familiar with that. There are wild grapes that we have. I'm not sure on species, but some of the wild grapes that we have actually are considered invasive. And even though that they are native, there are certainly wild grapes that will just vine and cover a tree or an area, and they certainly can be invasive. I've read that. However, I've not seen them as being any real concern, and especially because they're native, they provide really great edible resources for our native wildlife as well. Claudia asked if autumn olive resembles the honeysuckles. Not really. I'll go back a couple slides. Autumn olive, actually I might as well just do it this way. Autumn olive is more of a shrub. So it's going to be much more shrubby. So it's gonna look kind of like this here. And again, that silver leaf is definitely a key characteristic. Whereas the honeysuckles, they definitely have shrub honeysuckles in there, but they kind of form more of like a matte type looking thing. A lot more greener foliage, a little brighter. There are some pretty distinct characteristics, but again, if you're looking at an autumn olive, you will know it because it will have that distinct silver underside there. Jay asked if I'll come to your house. I am more than happy to come over and help identify any species you have on your property. So just send me an email and we'll set something up for sure. Is black locust considered invasive or just aggressive? I have not seen that described as invasive. However, I know it can certainly be a nuisance tree. And I believe it's one of the hardest woods that we have in Pennsylvania. So it's pretty hard to even just cut down. I have heard that it's a very aggressive tree though. I'm gonna put my contact information back up for you guys. Joe mentioned that the mile-a-minute weevils do not help, or any idea when we will have a source. I am honestly not sure. I just learned about mile-a-minute weevils as I was making this presentation, so I thought it was pretty cool, so I threw it in there. However, I do not know of a source offhand, but I could certainly look into that. Have I eaten young knotweed shoots? And what do they taste like? I have, not the tastiest, but they're also not gross by any means. They kind of like an asparagus. Actually, they even really young shoots even look like asparagus, but they don't have too much flavor. So you can certainly kind of add in whatever flavors you want in there. I've had it as a little casserole, as a quiche. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can do it. You can make, instead of zucchini bread, you can make knotweed bread. So it behaves pretty similar to something like asparagus. They're very tender. Not something I want to eat on a regular basis, but they certainly are something to try out sometime. Thank you, Cheryl. So if you guys have any other questions, I'm happy to stick around. We have about 5 more minutes left. Anything off topic too, I'm happy. Trying to get rid of English ivy. Does it respond to glyphosate? Honestly, I think anything responds to glyphosate. I'm not aware of anything that will not respond to it. Glyphosate's pretty generalized. Anything that's herbaceous, it'll kill. It's a pretty tough chemical. All right, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your time and all of your questions. If you have any other questions, happy to stick around, but if not, I hope you guys have a really great Labor Day weekend. I have a 4-day weekend coming up, so I'm looking forward to that. Okay, Mary Jo says triclopyr is actually better for English ivy. Thank you, Mary. All right, guys. If we don't have any other questions, have about 3 minutes left here, but I'll stick around until 1 o'clock. But if you guys are ready to head out, that's all right with me. But again, thank you so much for taking your time. Hopefully your lunch break was well spent and you learned a bunch. And I really hope that you guys can join me in our future webinars that we have. Like I mentioned, on the 14th, you can sign up for our webinar with the Fishing Creek Watershed Association. I'll be talking all about trees, which is one of my favorite subjects. So I definitely encourage you to come check that out. Do I have any monarch count information for this year? Honestly, I've read a lot that we had some issues with monarchs or just butterflies in general. We didn't have nearly as many this year. I believe it was because of the heat. I think that the heat really deterred them in some capacity. I'm not really sure on the specifics, but I did hear that the heat really affected our local butterflies. Luckily, you know, I've seen a lot of caterpillars on milkweeds, and I've seen a lot more this fall. So luckily the caterpillars did survive, but it seemed almost like the initial adults earlier in the spring were just really slow to come out. If not, they may not have come out, which is unfortunate. Advice for dealing with poison ivy: glyphosate, definitely just getting some Roundup. I would not advise pulling it, but you certainly could if you protect yourself, and try to, you can even put it in a plastic bag so that it kind of heats up in the sun and dies that way. But again, just an herbicide treatment. I wouldn't recommend hand pulling it, but that's your call. The overwinter population in Mexico is 53%. Wow. Wow, that's discouraging, that's for sure. Yeah, some people are more prone to poison ivy than others. I actually very, very rarely get it, and if I do, it's just a couple spots. I'm one of the lucky ones. But yeah, they can be a problem for a lot of people. All right, guys, well, it's about 1 o'clock, so I'm gonna end the webinar here. Again, thank you so much for joining in. I hope you have a really great Labor Day weekend. Enjoy the sunshine because it looks like it's gonna be beautiful out. And I hope you guys learned something new today.